At the funeral of my father, a general, I stood in my full dress uniform for the last time. My sister, Evelyn, pulled me aside. With a radiant smile for the crowd, she hissed in my ear, her voice dripping with venom. "You still have the nerve to wear that. You're not a captain anymore, Drew. You're the family disgrace." She thought she had erased me right there, in front of everyone. She had no idea she had just handed a weapon to the one person her father trained to use it. My name is Drew Parker, age 31. The nameplate on my uniform still read Parker, but the silver bars on my shoulders, the ones that designated me as a captain in the Virginia National Guard, felt like a lie I was telling myself. The funeral was a showcase of Elmswood's quiet power. My old Ford F-150, still caked in mud from the construction site I'd left just hours before, was a dirty smudge in a sea of gleaming black sedans and luxury SUVs parked outside St. John's Episcopal. The tires crunched on the gravel, a sound too loud, too coarse for the hushed reverence of the day. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, my hands gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel. Stepping out, I straightened my Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket crisp, the creases sharp, my boots polished to a mirror shine. It was a suit of armor I no longer had the right to wear, but it was the only one I had. I could feel the eyes on me as I walked toward the church steps. They weren't looks of sympathy for a daughter mourning her father, General Harrison Parker. They were looks of appraisal, of curiosity, of remembering a scandal best left buried. They saw an anomaly, a chapter everyone had agreed to tear out of the family history. Through the grand oak doors I saw them. My mother, Eleanor, and my younger sister, Evelyn, stood in a tight, elegant circle with a state senator. Their smiles were perfect, porcelain things that froze and cracked just a little when they saw me. Evelyn's hand tightened on the senator's arm, a subtle anchor. And my mother did something exquisitely cruel. She performed a slow, deliberate turn, her gaze lifting to a magnificent stained glass window as if she were a tourist, suddenly captivated by the artistry. It was a small, graceful movement, a masterclass in social maneuvering, an act of dismissal so profound it stole the air from my lungs. I found a spot in a back pew, an island in a sea of perfectly tailored suits and veiled hats. The service was a blur of platitudes about honor, legacy, and service. Words that, for me, had turned to ash. Afterward, as people gathered in the narthex, an old familiar voice cut through the quiet murmurs. "Captain Parker." It was Colonel John McGregor, my father's best friend, his eyes red-rimmed and raw with grief. He took a step toward me, his hand outstretched. "Drew," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "I am so sorry for your loss." A wave of warmth, of genuine human connection, washed over me. I opened my mouth to thank him, to say anything that would ground me in this surreal nightmare. But before a sound could escape, a cloud of expensive perfume and saccharine sweetness enveloped us. Evelyn. She glided to Colonel John's side, looping her arm through his. Her smile was blinding, her voice like honey. "Oh, Uncle John, thank you so much for coming. It means the world to us." She paused, her eyes flicking to me, a glint of cold amusement in their depths. Then she raised her voice, just enough for the surrounding clusters of mourners to hear clearly. "But she's not a captain anymore." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering and ugly. She let the silence stretch, savoring it. "Let's not make things awkward for everyone," she added, her tone now one of gentle, chiding concern. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, pressing in on me, sucking the sound from the cavernous space. Colonel John's face was a mask of confusion and embarrassment. He slowly, awkwardly withdrew his hand. I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot, searing shame that burned from my neck to my hairline. In front of my father's friends, my former colleagues in the house of God, she had stripped me of my rank, my honor, my very identity. Later, the procession moved to the National Guard Memorial, a serene, windswept field of perfectly aligned black granite stones. I broke away from the crowd, my feet carrying me with a grim sense of purpose toward a specific section, toward a monument for a mission I knew intimately. Project Aegis. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a painful thud. I found the polished stone, its surface reflecting the cold gray sky. And then I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. The space that should have held my name, my contribution, Captain Drew Parker, was not empty, it was occupied. Engraved in its place were the words, Sergeant Michael Donovan. Donovan. The name hit me like a physical blow. I remembered him vividly. A kid who panicked, who deserted his post after a critical error that nearly cost lives. They hadn't just erased me, they had replaced me with a coward, a deserter. The message was unmistakable, a final brutal insult carved in stone. It was a public declaration. A traitor was worth more to my father's legacy than I was. I didn't realize how long I'd been standing there until the crowd had thinned, until the only sounds were the wind and the distant closing of car doors. As I walked back to my truck, a figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree, blocking my path. My mother. I saw you staring at the stone, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used to instruct the household staff. Don't cause any more trouble, Drew, she continued, her eyes as cold and hard as the granite I'd just left. Your father's legacy is fragile enough as it is. She stepped closer and thrust a white business envelope into my hand. It was thick. This is a check. Consider it your share, she stated, not offered. I don't want to see you at the house. Give your father's car keys to the lawyer and go. She didn't say, Mom doesn't want to. She said, I don't want to. Even in her words, she had surgically removed our relationship. She was buying my silence, paying me to disappear. She was ratifying my erasure, executing one final clean command. My banishment. The Ford's engine rumbled, a low, steady complaint against the silence as I drove away from St. John's, away from Elmswood. The check my mother had given me was a dead weight on the passenger seat. I didn't look at it. I just drove, the highway stretching out before me like a long gray ribbon of nothing. My mind, however, wasn't on the road. It was drifting backward, sifting through the wreckage of the past, trying to build a map of my own destruction. Why was I never enough for them? The question echoed in the cab of the truck, and an image surfaced, sharp and clear. I was 16, standing on a firing range at the local guard armory, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the humid Virginia air. My father stood behind me, his arms crossed, a general even in his civilian polo shirt. I'd just put 10 rounds from my rifle into a tight, perfect circle in the center of the paper target, bullseye after bullseye. I looked back at him, my chest swelling with a rare flicker of pride, hoping for a nod, a smile, anything. He walked to the target, studied the holes, then turned to me. His eyes weren't proud, they were analytical, dissecting me like a tactical problem. Accuracy is fine, Drew, he said, his voice clipped and even. But you lack a killer instinct. You think too much. Sometimes to win, You have to be willing to sacrifice a piece on the board. It was years before I understood I was the piece. That same week, my sister Evelyn won the Miss Virginia teen pageant. Her victory came after a vicious rumor about the front-runner mysteriously surfaced, causing her to drop out in tears. That evening, I overheard my father on the phone, chuckling. "That's my girl," he'd said. "That's instinct. The girl knows how to get what she wants." He saw my precision as a flaw and her ruthlessness as a virtue. The memories kept coming unbidden. A Thanksgiving dinner from a few years ago. The house was filled with the warm scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, but the air was thick with unspoken rules. I was home on leave, buzzing with excitement. I'd just been selected for a specialized training program at Fort Bragg, a huge step in my career. "That's great news," I'd announced at the dinner table. My father, carving the turkey with military precision, just nodded. "Good," he said without looking up. "Try to keep up." His praise was a dismissal. A moment later, Evelyn, dressed in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly salary, clapped her hands together. "Guess what? I've been invited to join the executive board of the Junior League." The knife stopped. My father put it down, picked up his wineglass, and stood. A broad, genuine smile spread across his face. "To my daughter," he toasted, his voice booming with pride. "Congratulations. This is the Parker legacy. Not fighting some forgotten battle in a god-forsaken corner of the world, but building influence right here, in the rooms where power is brokered." I sat there, a guest at my own family's table, my achievements rendered invisible, next to my sister's social climbing. He had always dreamed of me, going to West Point, of following in his exact footsteps. But when my mother fell ill for a time, I chose the National Guard. It was a way to serve, to build my own career, but also stay close enough to help. He never said it, but I knew he saw it as a second-rate choice, a failure to launch, a debt he never fully forgave. The real reason for my erasure wasn't a single failure, but a single act of integrity. The memory was one I had tried to bury. I was on a classified mission overseas, training a local militia. It was supposed to be a straightforward advisory role, but I discovered our allied unit was using the U.S. aid, the very equipment we were providing, to carry out political assassinations. They were settling old scores, wiping out rivals under the guise of counterinsurgency. The order came down from my direct superior, one of my father's oldest friends and political allies. "Look the other way, Captain. This is above your pay grade." I couldn't. I filed a clandestine report, documenting everything with dates, names, and coordinates. I bypassed the chain of command, sending it through a secure, confidential channel. It was the right thing to do. It was what my father, the general, had always taught me duty was. But the potential political fallout was immense. It threatened relationships, embarrassed allies, and risked public scandal. My father, faced with a choice between his daughter's career and his political capital, made a difficult tactical decision, as he later called it in our one and only phone call on the matter. He agreed to sacrifice me to quiet the storm. I was honorably discharged, the official reason a vague "for reasons of command," a quiet, career-killing phrase that would follow me forever. I called it what it was: betrayal. But the deepest cut, the wound that refused to scar over, came from my mother. After I was forced out, adrift and heartbroken, I wrote her a letter. 10 pages, front and back, poured out onto paper. I explained everything: the illegal orders, the moral line I refused to cross, the truth. I pleaded with her, not for intervention, but just for understanding, for her to see me. Weeks went by. Nothing, no call, no email. I finally drove to the house to pick up the last of my things, a box of books and old photos from my room. As I was leaving, I glanced at the small trash can under my mother's mahogany writing desk in the study. There it was, my letter, my 10-page plea for help. It was torn neatly into 4 perfect squares, sitting on top of a discarded catalog. She hadn't even afforded it the dignity of a shredder. She hadn't even read it. My father's punishment was an act of political calculus. But my mother's silence, her tearing up my truth without a glance, that was an act of choice. She had chosen his legacy over her daughter. She had chosen the pristine reputation of the Parker name over the messy reality of my integrity. In that quiet, empty study, I finally understood. I was well and truly alone. After the funeral, I didn't go back to Elmswood. I drove the 2 hours south to my small rented apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Richmond. This was my world now, and had been for 6 years. There were no cocktail parties here, no fake pleasantries exchanged over tea. My life was measured by the clang of metal on metal from the diesel truck repair shop where I worked, the persistent smell of grease that clung to my clothes, and the small, honest paychecks that came with it. Here, I was just Drew, the quiet woman in Bay 3 who was good with engines. No one knew the Parker name, and no one cared. This anonymity was both a curse and a liberation. It was a stark reminder of everything I had lost, but it also gave me a clean slate. It allowed me to rebuild myself from nothing on my own terms, with my own 2 hands. My apartment was sparse, the walls thin, the paint peeling in one corner. Taped to the wall opposite my bed was a yellowed, creased piece of paper I'd printed out years ago. It wasn't a scenic landscape or a band poster. It was a quote from a speech by Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." Every morning at 5 a.m., when my muscles ached from a long day of wrestling with stubborn bolts and heavy machinery, I would read those words. They were my morning coffee, my silent drill sergeant. My family, with their perfect smiles and calculated cruelties, they were the critics in the stands, safe, clean, and judgmental. But me, I was in the arena. My face was literally marred by dust and grease, and I was still fighting. It hadn't been an easy fight. About a year after my discharge, drowning in debt and desperation, I'd tried to get back into the world I was trained for. I put on my only good suit and drove to D.C. for an interview at a top-tier private security firm. The man who interviewed me was a retired colonel, someone who had served under my father. Hope is a dangerous thing. I had allowed myself a flicker of it. He looked over my service record, his posture rigid. His finger paused at the 6-year-old entry. "Drew," he'd said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your file shows an interruption, a significant one. We can't take a risk on an officer who was relieved for reasons of command. You understand." He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't give me a chance to defend myself. My father's erasure was an invisible brand, a life sentence that followed me everywhere, closing doors before I could even knock. So I'd stayed in the arena of the garage. My boss, Sal, owned the shop. He was a Marine veteran, a wiry, tough-as-nails guy, who'd fought at Khe Sanh and whose hands were permanently stained with the ghosts of old oil. He rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time and never once asked about my past. He didn't need to. He saw the discipline in the way I organized my tools and the focus in my eyes when I diagnosed a faulty engine. One blistering summer afternoon, I was on my lunch break, sitting in the cab of my truck to escape the heat, the vinyl seat sticking to my back. I wasn't eating. I was reading a heavily underlined book on tactical cryptography, trying to keep the rust off the parts of my brain that knew more than just engine schematics. The driver's side window darkened. It was Sal. He didn't say anything. He just tapped on the glass with a scarred knuckle. When I rolled it down, he handed me an ice-cold bottle of water and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. It was a thick roast beef sandwich on rye, the kind his wife made for him every day. "Eat up, soldier," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Don't run the brain on an empty tank." He walked away, his back straight, his steps economical. I looked down at the simple offering in my hands. It wasn't a gourmet meal from a country club luncheon. It was real food from a real person, and that word, soldier. It wasn't captain, a title they had stripped from me. It wasn't Parker, a name they had tarnished. It was the very essence of what I was. A single word of recognition from a man who had seen real combat, who understood service in his bones, was a validation more powerful than any medal my family had ever polished for display. It was a reminder that even when you're alone in the arena, sometimes someone on the outside sees you, not the critic, but another fighter. A few days after the funeral, the four walls of my apartment started to close in. The silence was too loud. Driven by an impulse I didn't fully understand, I drove out towards Fort Lee, pulling into the gravel lot of a place called the Cannon's Mouth. It was a dive bar, the kind of place career soldiers went, to drink cheap beer and tell stories that would never make it into an official report. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer and quiet regret. I took a small table in the darkest corner, nursing a bottle of water, content to just be a ghost. But a few minutes later, a man approached my table. He was thin, with salt and pepper hair that made him look older than the 30-something years I figured he was. I recognized him instantly. Jedediah Jed Stone, from Project Aegis. My guard went up immediately. "Captain Parker," he said. His voice was a low rasp, cured by too many cigarettes. I didn't correct him. I just watched him. "I know you're not a captain anymore," he continued, seeming to read my mind. "But to me, you still are." He pulled out the chair opposite me. "I was there, at the church. I heard what your sister said." He shook his head, his expression grim. "That was a damn disgrace." His bluntness caught me off guard. He sat down, flagged the bartender, and ordered 2 Budweisers without asking. When they arrived, he pushed one toward me. "My story first," he said, taking a long swallow from his bottle. "You deserve to know why I'm here." He told me he'd been the tech specialist on our team. He was erased, as he put it, for asking the wrong questions about safety protocols during a joint training exercise with a team of private military contractors, the Stryker Group. "Those guys acted like they were kings," Jed said, his voice laced with a bitter anger I knew all too well. Walking around with unauthorized gear, ignoring comms discipline, I filed a report, said their sloppy work was going to get someone killed. He took another drink. 2 days later, I was called into an office, accused of sowing discord and being mentally unstable. "Your father," he signed the order. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I wasn't the only one. "Listen, Drew," Jed leaned forward, lowering his voice, his eyes scanning the room. "I don't think your father was the one pulling the strings. I think he was squeezed." He looked around again before continuing. "Stryker is in bed with a certain state senator, the same one your mother was talking to at the funeral. They had something on the general, some old mistake he made, leverage, and there was someone else who knew about it. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. A guy named Silas Croft, a data analyst genius at the DIA. He was the one who found the connection between Stryker's contracts and the senator's campaign funds. He was putting the pieces together, and then, right before you were discharged, he vanished. Officially, he went on an indefinite leave of absence. Unofficially, he dropped off the face of the earth. Silas Croft. The name etched itself into my mind. I tried to look into it, Jed confessed, his gaze dropping to the scarred wooden table. But I'm just an electrician now. They watched me for a while, tapped my phone. I had to let it go, but... He glanced up, his eyes meeting mine. I managed to back up a few things before they locked me out of the system. With a practiced, subtle movement, he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small, old-looking USB drive across the table, covering it with his hand. It was a deft, discreet transfer, the kind you learn when you know you're being watched. Encrypted comm logs between our unit's server and a ghost server owned by Stryker, he whispered. The encryption is military grade, way above my head, but maybe not yours. I looked from his intense, hopeful face to the small piece of plastic under his hand. It was a breadcrumb. It was a landmine. If you decide you want to dig, he said, pulling his hand back, I'll run logistics, comms, transport, whatever you need. We're the only ones left who remember the truth, Captain. He stood up, leaving his half-finished beer on the table. The offer's there, he said, then turned and walked out of the bar, melting back into the night. I sat there for a long time, the cold bottle of beer sweating onto the table. My fingers closed around the small rectangular shape of the USB drive in my pocket. For the first time in 6 years, the fight wasn't just inside my own head anymore. For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't alone. The USB drive Jed had given me felt like a live grenade in my pocket for a week. My mind was a battlefield, torn between exposing a conspiracy and the exhaustion of just trying to survive. Then the call came. It was from Mr. Caldwell, the Parker family lawyer for decades. His voice was a smooth, oily purr that I'd distrusted since I was a child. "Drew, my dear," he began, the false endearment setting my teeth on edge. "We need you to come by the office on Wednesday, just to finalize some paperwork regarding the General's will. Your mother and sister will be here. It's essential to carry out his final wishes properly." His final wishes. The phrase hung in the air, thick with hypocrisy. I wondered if they included having my name chiseled off a memorial. "I'll be there," I said, my voice flat. Caldwell's office was a shrine to old Virginia money. The air smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. Rich mahogany walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened, all sitting on a thick Persian rug that swallowed sound. It was a room designed to intimidate, to make you feel small before the gravity of the law. My mother and Evelyn were already seated at the massive conference table. They were a united front of quiet wealth, dressed in tasteful, expensive, neutral tones that screamed appropriate mourning. They looked like they had just come from a luncheon at the country club, not a meeting to carve up a dead man's life. I took the empty seat opposite them. The polished wood was cold against my forearms, a reflection of the two women staring back at me. The silence was a weapon, and they were experts at wielding it. Finally, Evelyn slid a thick stack of documents, bound in a neat blue cover, across the table. It landed in front of me with a soft, final thud. A practiced, placid smile was fixed on her face, but her eyes, so much like my father's, were cold stones. "It's just paperwork, Drew," she said, her voice soft and deceptively reasonable. "If you could just sign, we can get all of this over with smoothly and let Dad finally rest in peace." She emphasized the word smoothly. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat wrapped in silk. My time and intelligence had taught me one critical lesson: never trust the cover story. The bigger the smile, the sharper the knife. I picked up the document. Its weight felt wrong, too heavy for a simple disbursement. I ignored Caldwell's patronizing offer to walk me through the key points. My eyes scanned the pages, my training kicking in, filtering out the noise. I skipped past the dense, boilerplate legal jargon about executors and beneficiaries. I was looking for the fine print, the trap. And then I found it, tucked away in the very last section, under a bland heading titled Appendix C, Renunciation of Further Claims. A single devastating paragraph. It stipulated that in exchange for receiving a one-time symbolic inheritance payment, I would agree to permanently and irrevocably waive all rights and claims to the Parker Family Trust. The trust. The heart of the family's wealth. A vast portfolio of stocks, real estate, and investments my father had spent a lifetime building. This wasn't about settling a will. This was an ambush. They weren't just trying to buy my silence. They were trying to legally disown me, to strip me of my birthright. A cold, clear anger settled over me. It wasn't hot and messy, like the shame at the funeral. It was focused, sharp, a weapon being honed. I slowly pushed the thick document across the gleaming table until it rested in front of my mother. I met her gaze. "You know what's in here, don't you?" I asked. My voice was quiet, dangerously calm, stripped of all emotion. My mother, Eleanor, picked up her glass of water and took a delicate, unhurried sip. Her hand was perfectly steady. She showed no surprise, no shame, no flicker of emotion at all. She placed the glass back on its leather coaster with a soft, deliberate click. "I do," she said, her voice as cool and crisp as an autumn morning. "Your father worked his entire life to build that legacy. It's meant for Evelyn, for the daughter who will carry on the family name with dignity." She looked directly at me then, her eyes like chips of ice. "It is not meant for the one who chose to disgrace us. You don't deserve it, Drew. Accept that. Take your check and go. You don't deserve it." There it was. The final verdict, delivered without flinching. It wasn't about my career choice, or a mission gone wrong, or even about protecting a legacy. It was simpler than that. In their eyes, I was fundamentally unworthy. The words weren't just a dismissal of my financial rights. They were a dismissal of my entire existence. They were the final swing of the hammer, meant to shatter me into pieces. But they miscalculated. That single sentence didn't break me. It forged me. It severed the last frayed thread of hope I might have held for reconciliation. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a declaration of war. I looked from my mother's impassive face to Evelyn's smug, triumphant smile. The air in the mahogany-paneled room was thick with their victory. They had laid the trap, and they were waiting for me to step into it, just as I always had. But the woman who sat there was not the same one who had flinched at the funeral. The last 6 years had forged something harder in me. I met my mother's icy gaze, and for the first time I felt nothing but a cold, clear void. I pushed the thick document back to the center of the table. "I'm not signing," I said. My voice was calm, but the words landed with the heavy finality of a gavel. A flicker of surprise, of genuine shock, crossed their faces. It was a fleeting, satisfying sight. They were used to my retreat, my quiet acceptance of my place in the family hierarchy. They weren't prepared for defiance. Mr. Caldwell, the lawyer, cleared his throat, his smooth composure finally cracking. He started to drone on about legal ramifications, about the complexities of probate court. I cut him off. "I know what you're doing," I said, my voice low and steady, aimed not at him, but at my mother and sister. "The game is over." I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was jarring in the tomb-like silence of the room. I walked towards the door, not looking back, leaving them in a cloud of their own stunned silence. For the first time in my life, I had controlled the conversation by ending it. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of adrenaline. The high of my small victory didn't last long. That evening, my phone rang. It was Evelyn. The sweet, honeyed tone she reserved for public appearances was gone. In its place was a venomous hiss. "What do you think you're doing, Drew?" she shrieked into the phone. "You're ruining everything Dad worked for." I stayed silent, letting her rage wash over me. My silence only seemed to fuel her fury. When I didn't respond, she unleashed her final, most despicable weapon. "Do you remember those letters?" she spat. "The ones Dad wrote to you from Afghanistan? The ones you thought were so private?" A cold dread began to creep up my spine. "Mom gave them to me," she continued, her voice dripping with malicious glee. "All of them, and your replies too. If you don't sign those papers by Friday, I will make sure that a few of my journalist friends get to see them. Let them read all about your compassionate and weak little thoughts. Let's see what the world thinks of the war hero when they find out how you really felt." The line went dead. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. I slowly lowered it, my hand trembling. Those letters, they weren't just paper and ink. They were the one sacred thing I had left. Stored in a small wooden box in my closet, they were the only proof I had that once, in the quiet moments between patrols in a dusty, war-torn country, my father had seen me. His handwriting, the way he described the scent of the air, the questions he asked about my life back home, they were a connection that transcended the titles and expectations. My replies to him were raw, honest, full of doubts and hopes I never voiced to anyone else. To have Evelyn, my own sister, take that sanctuary and turn it into a tool for blackmail. It was an invasion of the soul, a violation so profound it made the financial betrayal feel trivial. I slid down the wall, my legs giving out, and sat heavily on the cold linoleum floor of my kitchen, and I cried. But it wasn't the weeping of sorrow or self-pity. It was something different. A single hot tear of pure, undiluted rage rolled down my cheek. It felt like the last tear I would ever shed for them. It was the final straw, the one insult too many. I pushed myself up from the floor, my movements stiff, robotic. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The rage didn't disappear, it solidified. It morphed from a chaotic, burning emotion into a cold, clear purpose. They had taken my career, they had taken my honor, they had tried to take my inheritance, and now they wanted to take my memories. They wanted to weaponize the last good thing I had of my father, and in doing so, destroy that too. My eyes found the faded poster on my wall. The man in the arena. They had pushed me. They had kicked me when I was down. They had tried to erase me. But they made a critical error. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. I was no longer a spectator in my own tragedy. Tell me, if you were me, what would you do? Would you let them win? I picked up my phone, my fingers steady now. I scrolled to a number I hadn't called in years but had never deleted. It rang twice. "Yeah?" Jed's gravelly voice answered. "Jed, it's me, Drew." There was a pause on the other end. "Captain, what's wrong?" "I'm in," I said, my voice low and hard as steel. "We're going to burn it all to the ground." My phone call with Jed was a declaration of war. The next night, our war council convened. Our command center was Sal's garage, long after the last mechanic had gone home. The vast space, usually echoing with the sound of air wrenches, was quiet. Under the stark glare of a single overhead light, Jed and I huddled over a beat-up, secured laptop I kept for my own projects. The air smelled of oil and steel. This was my arena, and tonight it became our war room. I slid the USB drive into the port. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my old training taking over. The files were locked down with a complex military-grade encryption algorithm. But my father's obsession with my lack of killer instinct had overlooked one thing. He had trained me to be a world-class intelligence officer. 6 years of civilian life hadn't erased that. The muscle memory was still there. For hours I worked, Jed watching over my shoulder, keeping a fresh pot of burnt coffee going. Finally, as dawn approached, a single line of green text flashed across the black screen. "Access granted." Jed let out a low whistle. "Damn, Captain, you still got it." The screen filled with raw data, communication logs, thousands of lines of them, a dizzying stream of timestamps, code names, and encrypted message fragments. To a civilian, it would have been gibberish. To me, it was a language I understood. We sifted through the digital noise, looking for a signal, and then I found it. A recurring encrypted string, sent from a single, heavily cloaked IP address to a Striker group server. It was a whisper in a hurricane, but it was consistent. I began the painstaking work of unmasking the IP address. It was a masterclass in obfuscation, bouncing through proxy servers in 6 countries. I used every open-source intelligence, or OSINT, technique I knew. It was a high-stakes game of digital breadcrumbs. And finally, I traced the origin point. Not to some high-tech facility, but to a public internet terminal at a small-town library and coffee shop in a sleepy, remote town nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The town was less than 20 miles from where Silas Croft, the DIA analyst, had last been seen before his indefinite leave of absence. "He's not missing, Jed," I said, a grim thrill running through me. "He's in hiding." Jed nodded, his face serious. "He's smart, ghosting himself in a place no one would ever think to look." But there was more. Tucked away in a subfolder on the drive, mislabeled as maintenance schedules, was a small cache of backed-up emails. Plain text. They were from Jed's old work account. My breath hitched when I saw the sender and recipient lists. It was a chain of correspondence between my father, the lawyer Caldwell, and my mother. I stared at her name on the screen, Eleanor Parker. Jed saw my face and fell silent. She hadn't just been a passive bystander. She had been an active participant. I clicked open one of her emails, my blood turning to ice as I read. The subject line was the Drew problem. In it, she wrote to Caldwell, "We need to ensure Drew's story is handled discreetly and never becomes public. The General Parker Memorial Fund has its largest fundraising gala of the year next month. Any hint of scandal would be a catastrophe for our donors." A catastrophe, not for the family, not for my father's memory, for the donors. She wasn't concerned with the truth, or with me, or even with the honor my father supposedly cherished. She was concerned with the flow of checks from wealthy patrons. The foundation, the galas, the polite society she reigned over, that was her legacy, and she had sold me out to protect it. A cold, hard clarity washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my personal rage. This was no longer just about my pain. It was about a systemic rot, a web of deceit that went far beyond my family. "They think we're broken soldiers," I said quietly, my voice low and hard. I turned to Jed, my eyes reflecting the glowing green text on the screen. "They're wrong." I pulled a greasy notepad toward me and sketched out a plan. "A mission. 3 phases," I said, the words coming fast and clear. "Phase 1. We find Silas Croft. We get his testimony, whatever it takes. Phase 2. We use these logs to irrefutably link the striker group's illegal activities to their political protection, with my father as the linchpin. Phase 3. I paused, looking at Jed, a fire in my eyes. "We choose the time and the place. We go public, not on their terms, on ours. A stage so bright they can't possibly control the narrative." I drew a hard line under the 3 points. "We're not attacking my family, Jed," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "We're attacking their legacy. We're going to dismantle it, piece by piece, with the one thing they're terrified of, the truth." The annual General Harrison Parker Legacy Scholarship Gala was the crown jewel of Elmswood's social calendar. It was held in the grand ballroom of the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond, a place of soaring ceilings, marble columns, and old-world opulence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful people making polite conversation. This was my mother's and sister's natural habitat. It was the perfect stage. I walked through the ornate entrance, an uninvited guest at my own family's coronation. I wasn't wearing my uniform. Tonight, I was just Drew Parker, dressed in a simple, sharp black pantsuit that was more functional than fashionable. It didn't matter. My presence alone was a grenade with the pin pulled. A wave of whispers rippled through the ballroom as heads turned. I saw the recognition, the curiosity, the sudden hushed conversations behind raised hands. At the head table, on the raised dais, I saw them. My mother and Evelyn, seated on either side of the guest of honor, State Senator Abernathy. Their smiles were radiant under the crystal chandeliers. Then Evelyn saw me. Her smile faltered, replaced by a mask of pure horror. Her hand immediately went to her phone, her thumb flying across the screen. Across the room, I saw 2 uniformed security guards receive a message and turn their heads, their eyes finding me in the crowd. They started moving in my direction, slow and deliberate, but they were already too late. Jed, my man on the inside, was already in the hotel's AV room. On stage, the master of ceremonies was in the middle of a glowing tribute. A man whose legacy of honor and unwavering integrity continues to inspire us all. General Harrison Parker was more than a soldier. He was a pillar of our community. He gestured to the large projection screen behind him, where a stoic, black and white portrait of my father was displayed. Right on cue, the image on the screen flickered. It dissolved into a cascade of digital static, a harsh buzzing sound that cut through the MC's syrupy voice. The screen went black. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Then a new voice filled the room, amplified through the hotel's state-of-the-art sound system. It was not the MC. It was a voice from the grave, clear and steady. A voice they thought they had silenced forever. "My name is Silas Croft," the voice said. It was a recording, one we had spent 3 days securing from a terrified man in the Blue Ridge Mountains. 6 years ago, I was a data analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was not on leave. I was forced into hiding. The ballroom was utterly silent. You could hear a pin drop. I was tasked with auditing logistical support for Project Aegis. Silas's voice continued, calm and factual. I discovered that our primary contractor, the Stryker Group, was systematically overbilling the government and funneling a portion of those funds into the personal accounts of a high-ranking politician. When I reported my findings, I was told to drop it. My superior, General Harrison Parker, was under immense pressure from his political allies. To cover up the corruption, he needed a scapegoat for a mission that was about to go public for all the wrong reasons. He chose a decorated loyal officer from his own command. He chose Captain Drew Parker. I watched my mother's face. The elegant mask of the grieving widow had shattered, replaced by a rictus of panic. Evelyn looked like she was going to be sick. As Silas's recorded testimony ended, the screen behind the stage flickered back to life. It wasn't my father's portrait, it was an email, the first of the damning communications between my father's office and the CEO of the Stryker Group. Jed, our ghost in the machine, enlarged the text so everyone could read it. The situation is contained. Parker has been relieved. Full cooperation expected. The next slide was another email, and another, a timeline of deceit, laid bare for all to see. The final slide was the one that hit closest to home. It was my mother's email to the lawyer. The General Parker Memorial Fund has its largest fundraising gala of the year next month. Any hint of scandal would be a catastrophe for our donors. The silence in the room was now a living, breathing entity. It was heavy, suffocating. The only sounds were the soft, frantic clicks of cameras from the press section in the back. I watched Senator Abernathy, my mother's honored guest, the politician Silas had mentioned. He stared at the screen, his face pale. Then, in a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible, he slowly, carefully, pushed his chair back, creating a small but significant distance between himself and my mother. The rats were leaving the sinking ship. Every eye in the room, hundreds of them, swiveled from the screen, from my horrified family to me. I stood my ground in the center of the floor, the storm I had unleashed raging around me. A young reporter, a woman named Isla Vance, whom Jed had secretly briefed, broke through the stunned security line. She thrust a microphone toward my face, a live camera feed trailing her. "Captain Parker," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "do you have anything to say?" I looked past her, past the flashing cameras, and directly at the head table. My mother and sister stared back, their faces as white as the tablecloths before them. Their world was collapsing in real time on live television. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to cry, or list my grievances. My evidence had already spoken for me. I held the camera's gaze, and in a voice that was clear, calm, and carried across the entire silent ballroom, I asked a single question. "Now," I said, my eyes locked on my mother, "who's embarrassing the family?" The question hung in the air, a final devastating charge that no one could answer. The aftermath was exactly what I had predicted, a media firestorm. By the next morning, our story was a roaring blaze. The Parker scandal, a legacy of lies. The ghost of Project Aegis speaks. Every news channel was running clips from the gala on a loop. The screen going black, the shock on my mother's face, my final question hanging in the air like a guillotine. The footage was inescapable. I watched it from the quiet of my apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. Jed had called to check in, his voice buzzing with a nervous energy, but I barely registered his words. The General Parker Memorial Fund was officially frozen, its assets under review by the State Attorney General. Stryker Group's stock had plummeted as federal investigators announced a formal inquiry. And in a final quiet series of erasures, my father's name was discreetly removed from the letterhead of two prominent charities and a university library wing. The legacy they had sacrificed me to protect had been meticulously built over decades. It crumbled to dust in a single night. I clicked the TV off, the sudden silence of the room more jarring than the noise. I expected to feel joy, a sense of triumph, or at least the grim satisfaction of justice served. Instead, there was just a vast, hollow emptiness, a profound exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. The war was over, and I was the last one standing on the battlefield, surrounded by wreckage. A few days later, my phone rang, shrill and demanding. I saw Evelyn's name flash on the screen. Against my better judgment, a morbid curiosity made me answer. There was no crying. There wasn't even a pretense of civility. Just the raw, unrestrained shrieking of a cornered animal. "Are you happy now, Drew?" she screamed, her voice cracking with a fury that was almost impressive. "You've destroyed everything Dad worked for. Mom is in the hospital with stress-related hypertension. My fiancé called off the engagement this morning because his family doesn't want to be associated with this mess. All of our donors have pulled out. It's all your fault, you selfish bitch." I listened to her tirade, my own emotions strangely absent. It was like watching a storm from behind thick, soundproof glass. The words were just noise. She still didn't get it. She wasn't sorry for what they had done. She was just sorry they got caught. She was mourning the loss of her status, her money, her perfect, curated life. Not the loss of her integrity or her family. She was a reflection of our mother, a perfect product of Elmswood's poisonous values. Without a word, I ended the call. Then I opened my contacts, found her name, and pressed block. A small, simple, digital action that felt as final as closing a casket. The final blow came a few days after that, not as a shout, but as a whisper. An email appeared in my inbox. The sender was my mother's personal account. The subject line contained a single, poignant word. Daughter. For a split second, my heart clenched. A foolish, stubborn part of me, a part I thought had died long ago, dared to hope. For an apology, for an explanation, for a single word of remorse, for anything. I clicked it open. The body of the email contained only one sentence, stark and black against the white screen. "Your father will never forgive you for this." That was it. No remorse, no accountability. Just one last curse, one final attempt to wound me, using the ghost of my father as her weapon. It was her final, cowardly act of violence. I stared at the words, then calmly moved my cursor to the trash icon and clicked. Delete. The relationship was gone. The mother I had once known, or perhaps the mother I had always wished for, was gone. In a way, she was right. I was no longer her daughter. That connection had been severed long ago. This was just the official death certificate, signed and delivered. That evening, Jed called. His voice was tired but steady. "They're trying to reach me, Drew," he said. "Caldwell, your mother's lawyer. He says they want to negotiate a settlement. They want this to go away." I took a long, slow breath, feeling the last of the emotional fog lift from my mind. In its place was a hard, cold clarity. The time for family drama was over. The time for quiet suffering was over. They had tried to handle this with social pressure, with emotional blackmail, with money. Now it was my turn to set the terms of engagement. "Tell them there's nothing to negotiate, Jed," I said, my voice firm, the words tasting like freedom. From now on, all communication goes through my lawyer. You got a lawyer? He asked, a hint of surprise and respect in his voice. I do now, I replied. I had spent the afternoon on the phone, retaining one of the best military justice attorneys in the country, and tell them she's very good. This was no longer a family matter to be whispered about in drawing rooms or settled with a quiet check. This was a legal proceeding. A line had been drawn, not in the sand where it could be washed away by the tides of emotion. This line was drawn in steel. 6 months after the gala, an official-looking letter arrived in my mailbox. It bore the seal of the Department of Defense. My hands were steady as I opened it. The words inside were formal, precise, and everything I had fought for. The internal investigation was complete. My military record, they wrote, had been fully restored, with a formal apology for the administrative error. They invited me to a small ceremony in D.C. to be properly presented with the medals I had earned but never received. I wrote back the next day. I politely declined the ceremony, but requested that the medals be sent to me by mail. I didn't need a public display anymore. The truth, spoken aloud, in that silent ballroom, had been the only ceremony I ever needed. The rest was just paperwork. The legal battle that followed was quiet but decisive. With the evidence we had, my family's lawyers settled quickly. The money wasn't a victory, but it was a tool. I used a portion of it, along with Jed and Sal, to start a small nonprofit organization. We called it the Arena Project. Sal's old garage became our headquarters. We renovated the front office, replacing the greasy calendars with whiteboards and shelves of legal texts. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. We provided pro bono legal aid, job training, and psychological counseling for veterans who had been chewed up and spat out by the very system they had sworn to serve. There were no mahogany desks or leather-bound books here, just coffee, respect, and a deep, unspoken understanding. Our clients were men and women who, like us, had their faces marred by dust and sweat and blood. We were building a new legacy, one honest repair at a time. A year to the day after my father's funeral, on a crisp, windy November afternoon, I drove back to the National Guard Memorial. The air was clean and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. I walked to the black granite stone for Project Aegis. It was different now. It had been remade. The name of Michael Donovan, the deserter, was gone. In its place, carved deep and clear into the polished stone, were the words Captain Drew Parker. And right below my name, a new line had been added, SGT Jedediah Stone. Our names were back where they belonged, silent testaments to a truth that had refused to stay buried. I placed a single white rose at the base of the stone. It wasn't for my father. It was for the forgotten soldiers, the names that get erased, the stories that get silenced. It was a promise that as long as I was around, someone would remember. I drove home to my small apartment, which still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The check from the settlement had allowed me to buy it, to finally own a small piece of the world that was mine. On my simple wooden desk, next to my laptop, sat a small, unadorned wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, were the medals the Army had sent, a bronze star, a purple heart. I never displayed them. They were a chapter of my life that was now closed. Beside the box lay the manuscript of a book I had started writing. It wasn't a tell-all, not a story of revenge. It was a story of survival, a guide for others who found themselves in the arena. Its working title was A Race to be Remembered. I looked out my window. The sun was rising over Richmond, casting a warm, golden light over the city. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The war was over. The ghosts were quiet. My legacy wasn't the Parker name, with its tarnished glory and hollow traditions. My legacy was the truth. It was the quiet work we did at the garage. It was the names on the stone. It was the story I was now free to tell. And it was mine, built from the ground up, with my own 2 hands. My fight in the arena is over, but I know I'm not the only one who has ever had to step inside one. It took me years to understand that my true value wasn't in the Parker name or the rank on my uniform, but in the strength I found when I refused to stay broken. Now I want to hear from you. How did you find your voice when someone tried to silence you? What gives you the strength to keep fighting? Your stories of resilience are a testament to the human spirit, and they matter. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like mine give you strength, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can remind the world that no one deserves to be erased.